So we're going to talk about guitar setup today. It's a topic that goes around the internet a lot, and there's tons of crap out there which allows you to get the wrong end of the stick 99% of the time. We're going to define a few terms first, and then I'm going to talk about what I do personally and the best ways to set up your instrument so that you get the most out of it. First things first then. Action. What actually is that, and how should you measure it? Action and neck relief go hand in hand, and you can't set one up without the other. A lot of techs might disagree with me on this one, but in terms of how the instrument feels, it's really important to get the neck relief right first than it is to get the action right. So what do I mean by that? Most great players, people who play really, really fast, really technical stuff and really need a lot of dexterity on the instrument, have a really flat neck on their guitars. And there's actually a lot of information on the StewMac website, which I've linked in the comments on this video, for you to go and look at, because this is actually really common and a lot of people don't really talk about action as a measurement, but yes, you can measure it, and most players go as flat as they can get away with if they're playing super technical stuff. So we set that first. A lot of good guitars, I remember watching a thing with John Suhr, and he talked about how his way of setting up a guitar is to set the neck dead straight, and it's obviously not going to play dead straight most of the time because it's just not allowed to because of physics, but then you bring in a little bit of relief and a little bit more relief until you get away with it, and that's where you stop. Like, as soon as you get away with the minimum amount of relief, that's all you want, and that's how he sets up a lot of his guitars, and it works brilliantly. A lot of those guitars are designed to be quite flat, and they play really, really well. It's the reason that brand is known very well to a lot of people. So he really knows what he's talking about with that. Don't just take my word for it. But one of the things that's really important with that is it keeps your action consistent across the fretboard. So a lot of people will measure action at either the 12th fret or the 17th fret, but if you're doing that on a guitar that has a really high amount of relief in it, what are you actually measuring? Because it's going to change ridiculously between fret 12 and fret 17. So you can measure it in two different places, and then it's going to be wildly off, and you're never actually going to get the consistency across the neck. Why that's important is that it's already hard enough to play up on the dusty end of the fretboard with a lot of this technical stuff. Why make it 10 times harder by having a really spongy feeling to your strings that you can't really get rid of? So with action, always set your neck relief first, and then try and get that as flat as you can get it, and then you can go and think about how high you want your action. Now, there's a reason why a lot of techs don't like this. I'm not going to call anyone in particular out, but a lot of people who've tried to set up my guitars have said, I have the neck too flat. The reason they don't like having it flat is that it tests your fretwork. If you have a great fret job on a guitar, setting the neck really flat doesn't make a difference. Whereas if you have slightly dodgy fretwork, it's exposed by setting the neck flat. People who are really good at fretwork don't care if you set it flat, but people who haven't done it properly often then say, oh, you should have more relief in this, as an excuse to try and make you avoid the problem, which is that they haven't done that good a job on the frets. So bear that in mind if you're talking to a guitar tech who majorly disagrees with me on this one. A lot of the time that is a skill issue, unfortunately. So we've set our neck flat, and then we need to set where our action actually is. So what is high action, what is medium action, and what is low action? Because these terms are not defined in measurements, and that is really frustrating for a lot of us. I'm going to do this in millimeters. You can do some conversions yourself if you don't use millimeters. But generally speaking, I think nearly every single guitar should start at 2 millimeters. That is sort of your medium action. You can do most things on 2 millimeters if your technique is really good. So it's not going to hamstring you at any point, but it's still got a good tone, and things are all going to sound good as long as the components of the instrument are good as well. So you set it at 2 mil, and then if that's slightly too high for you, you go down maybe 0.5 of a mil max. So I would consider a low action to be 1.5 mil-ish, and you want to be operating between 2 mil and 1.5 mil. That doesn't sound like a lot between medium and low action, and it's not, because you actually have pretty small margins for error. If you like a high action, I would go up to maybe 2.5 mil. Now, the reason why these are so tightly defined is because there's actually a lot of stuff of which becomes completely impossible on the extremes. So if you have a guitar with micro low action, let's say 1mm or less, quite often you will find 99% of even brilliant guitars do not want to do that, because you have to sort of build them and design into the process the ability to go super low. So you have to put a 0 fret in, you have to really make sure that you're playing on a very, very flat radius fretboard and things like that. Otherwise, those kind of actions are just not achievable. So I'm a Strat player, and I've been a Strat player for a very long time, played a lot of great Stratocasters. Nearly none of them I've ever had can go down to 1mm or less, just because the physics of this particular instrument, with a floating bridge, without that sort of Floyd Rose thing as well, and with a slightly curved fretboard, just don't allow you to do that. So again, be careful about the extremes on low action, because they're not necessary for you to be able to play really well, and also they are really difficult to achieve unless you have the right instrument for it. High action is very similar. There is no reason for you to go above 2.5mm. This is maybe slightly more of a controversial statement, but you can play slide on 2.5mm. You can play any of your bending licks on 2.5mm. You can play literally anything you want to do on that action. It sounds great, and it doesn't require much force to play a guitar that's set up like that. If you go further than that, you're literally just making it harder for yourself. You're not getting tone benefits. There are some people who will say, oh, 3-4mm action is going to give you loads of great tone. Great tone is in the amp, it's in the pickups, it's in the electronics of the guitar. 90% of the cases, it's not in your action that much. So your action is not going to magically give you the tone that you really like. It's more than often than not just going to make your life harder. So there's no point going up to 3mm, there's no point going up to 4mm. Stick at 2.5 and adjust everything else. One of the things I really want to make clear here is string gauge is heavily varied when it comes to how you look at other players. So like if you look at loads of world-class players, you see some people on 8s, some people on 9s, some people on 10s, some people on 11s. String gauge doesn't seem to matter. And that's definitely also been my experience. I can pick up a guitar that's 2 string gauges heavier than I normally play, and as long as it's set up well, pretty flat neck, and a decently, low action at around between 1.5 and 2mm, I can play it regardless. And the only thing I have a slight problem with is bending, because you've got to learn your bending sort of tensions again, because they're slightly different on higher string gauges. But the vast majority of things actually still work, and that's very interesting. So your string gauge has less of an effect on this than you think. It's more down to your set up in the first place before you've even put the strings on. A couple of other things when it comes to action, actually, that are really important. When you are thinking about going with a low action, if you can't get a low action on a Strat, one of the slight cheats you can use is to actually refret the whole guitar with incredibly high frets. I did this on my Suhr and it worked wonders. The Suhr had like quite worn down frets, and they were also not that big to begin with. So what I did is I put Jescar 58 118s on it, which are the highest frets you can buy with your money. So they come out way further than most frets do. So instead of actually adjusting the strings downwards this way, what I effectively did was bring the fret up a little bit. And that actually allowed me to get the action I wanted on that guitar without compensating for slightly worse tone or like slightly worse feeling from that slinkier low action thing. And also that guitar just didn't want to sit at a low action on the original fretwork. So instead I refretted it, brought the frets up, and that actually really helped. So that's a little bit of a trick if you want to try that one and you've got a guitar that's very stubborn and just won't go anywhere near the sort of action that you'd like to play at. Bear in mind the other really important things here are you need a great bridge on your guitar to be able to compensate for all these things and do these fine adjustments, and you need a really well cut nut. The nut is super important to keep the break angles really good, and if your nut is not cut that well, no matter what you do with the action, it's always going to play a little bit, just awkwardly, and particularly down close to the nut, you're going to really struggle because you can't do anything about that unless the nut's cut properly. So the nuts should always be cut relatively low. A lot of guitar techs, again, this is not a rant about how guitar techs sort of do things, but it is very true. A lot of guitar techs sort of go slightly more conservative on cutting the nut. So they cut it too high, and then the whole guitar is out because of that, and you can't adjust the action to compensate for a badly cut nut. So you want to have a little bit more bravery with cutting a nut properly and make sure you get as close as possible to what should actually be there, not just stop short because that's the safe option. It can be okay for sort of beginners and things like that, but as soon as you get on to trying to play really technical stuff, that's going to kick your ass every single time, and it's no fault of your own in terms of setup. It's just the nut is not cut properly. So learn all of these things and learn how to do them yourself as well, because it's really useful. And the only final point I was going to make on this is that any kind of floating bridge obviously makes your life a little bit more difficult. So, one of the things I did on this custom build, which was done by me for Munson Guitars, and it's a fantastic guitar, but I just decided to just put a fixed bridge in there because I just decided, you know what, I'm fed up of having to continually adjust a floating bridge. I don't really use the whammy bar system that much, so why not just put a floating bridge on it? That's an underrated thing to do, I think. A lot of people, they sort of save their whammy bar just in case they might need it on that one gig where they might play an Eddie Van Halen solo, and then 99% of the time they're not actually using it. So if you're not using it, why do you have it on your guitar? It's going to make everything more awkward. It makes tuning stability more awkward. It makes, just keeping your guitar at a decent action more awkward. All these kind of things. It's just a little bit more annoying to do all of that than it is on a fixed bridge. So if you are not using a trem system, don't put a trem system on your guitar. Sounds obvious, but it is actually really important. So all of those things considered, hopefully that helps you just have a bit of a think about how you set these things up. And I highly recommend checking out the StewMac website. I've linked it in the description and I'll link it in the comments as well, just for you to go away and have a look at some, world-class players and how they've set up their guitars according to their techs. And you will be surprised at how many of them have very similar setups in terms of very flat necks and a pretty low action on their instruments. Give it all a go, and I hope that helps.